charge of the Legislative Fiscal Office. Unfortunately for us, fortunately for him, his retirement is coming near, which is a huge loss for the legislature. He's just a fantastic resource. But we're really happy to have him here today to talk about the state budget. And so this will be our last presentation of the day, and he's going to talk to you about the process and sort of what you can expect next year. Do you need anything, or are you good?
No, I'm going to test out the table. 20, 25 years ago and 8 pounds ago, I could do this with confidence. I'm not so sure anymore, but I think I'm okay. Well, first of all, congratulations on getting this far. And you have my personal thanks. You have my personal admiration for giving it a try to try and get into the legislature, representing your constituencies in respective district. I am an institutional loyalist. I believe very, very strongly in separation of powers and the importance of the legislature in the entire process, not just budget, but policy making and so on. I don't necessarily dislike governors, but I don't work for them. I work for the legislature. So if you're elected, as Renee says, I won't be here, but my successors pretty well of the same mind. Okay, basically I got 45 minutes, half an hour to an hour. So I can't get you to a graduate degree in terms of overall budget, but I can kind of point you in the right direction. And that's what this handout is kind of geared towards. I use this handout with a number of groups, and as you may expect, you periodically do orientations for visiting groups. The Nebraska Lead program is one that comes readily in mind. And again, you get 45 minutes to kind of give people an orientation. And it's kind of evolved in this direction with the first page, where I'm pointing out some resources, some web-based pages that I think you as an aspirant to the legislature might want to take a look at. And then I'll get to the following 2 pages after we kind of walk through a couple things on that first page. Generally, the legislature's website is going to be a great place for you to start. You just go to that website, web address is there. There is a whole laundry list of links that you just ought to point, click, and explore. You will find out about my office. You will find out about the other offices. You will find out about any number of processes. You will find out about constitutional, whole constitution, statutes, and so on and so forth. So I would encourage you to your first start, that's where you want to go. Okay. If you want to get into the budget, the webpage, Legislative Council starts with reports. And when I speak to reports, it's Legislative Fiscal Office reports. And that will change over time. There will be a long laundry list of reports that will be dated Legislative Session 2018, which you can basically find this document that just recently got released and is on the web, should be on the website as of like about Thursday or Friday of last week. So if you want to know what happened during the 2018 legislative session with respect to the overall budget, go there, click on this page. If you want to know what happened the year before, you'll find the 2017 report. You can go back to 1992 or 93 or so if you're really interested. I'm not anymore. I lost interest a couple years after we got done. But you may want to do some research. I don't know, maybe there was an issue at a particular time that was of some important to you, you knew it was related to the budget. Okay. So I'd start there. There will be some other reports that we periodically will post. There are certain landmarks along the way in terms of the budget process, and I will touch on those when I get to the schedule that's at the bottom of the page. And I will also talk about a long session. But there are certain other reports that we will release. We have a responsibility to certain special committees. We have a responsibility to the Appropriations Committee. And then once we get into the legislative session, we'll be posting additional reports. They won't be as extensive as this, but they will be a snapshot as of that point in time as to what the situation looks like. We're constantly evaluating and reevaluating as we move through time. Okay. And And one of the frustrations I think that new individuals have as legislators is that you will feel like we are shooting at a moving target. And rest assured, you are. There will be any number of things that will cause an outlook to change. One will be periodic revisions to the revenue forecasts that we have to use in terms of building a budget, but also building a longer range financial plan. So we periodically will update our what we call financial status. It's a financial scorecard for the state's general fund. We will bring that up to date. Revised revenue forecast in October, we'll roll that in. We'll have a report in November that we issue. Legislature's leadership reviews it, authorizes its release. We'll kick it out in mid-November. So that will be one of the first real keys individuals coming into the legislature will have in terms of a financial outlook. We have a financial outlook right now. I guarantee you it will change. It will change because right now our financial outlook is based on an estimate how much revenue you're going to have this year. Fiscal year ends June 30th. We won't know exactly what we will collect. I will say that each and every forecast we have ever done has been wrong. Actuals will come in at something different. That will change the future flow, recalibrate, recalculate, reestimate. So that will be the first step, new revenue forecast. Then in October, there's a formal requirement in law for a forecast to be done, where there's a 9-member board in law. I serve as staff to it along with Department of Revenue's staff. We jointly do a revenue forecast. They synthesize a new estimate. That new estimate will roll into our financial outlook. So another change. Then after November, we'll get a first look at new budget requests. Our cycle has already started. We will see budget requests September 15th. Normally, in past years, I would sit down with my staff and deputy director, and we would look at those estimates, and we would start to kind of guess how we think some of those requests might have to turn out, so we can kind of give our leadership committee in November a look at not only the new revenue forecast, but going forward in terms of budget. Are there any ugly surprises out there? Are there any opportunities to be found? Is Medicaid costs running well below estimate? Do we have some ugly surprise in terms of school aid potential?
Below?
It's happening. It's not going to happen this year, though. I'll guarantee you that. But actually, Medicaid growth has been more moderate than what we have projected for quite some time. We've had years where growth was in excess of 10%. It's probably running somewhere around 3 or 4. It varies. We've had some other aid programs like for child welfare and so on that there have been some significant costs well above what was budgeted. Now, it's a decision whether people made a mistake budgeting or there was something else in terms of policy change or an environmental change that caused demand to go up. So we try and evaluate that. The point is there are certain benchmarks along the way going into this. That place in terms of those reports that the fiscal office posts or is on the legislature's website, you can find those out. And as you learn more about this situation, you'll get an idea as to what those benchmarks are. And that's one of the reasons I'm going to go through the timeline for you, because it'll flag some things for you coming up. Okay. Mentioned the timelines, that third website page. Legislative session calendar. The session calendar pretty much doesn't really show up. It's on the website, but it doesn't say anything, obviously, since we're not coming up on a legislative session. But I'm guessing somewhere around October, November, that calendar will be activated, and it's up to the speaker to frame a calendar for the next legislative session. So that's a good thing to take a look at, because if you win your election, that's going to dictate the rest of your life through about May or June, okay? The timing of how that calendar shakes out, okay? Hearing schedule, obviously, is on the legislative website. I point that out because somewhere along the line of probably, well, I mean, it could be in the next month or two, interim hearings. There are interim resolutions where the legislature has authorized a study of something and assigned it to a standing committee. It's probably worth a look once in a while to see what's out there, what Department of Revenue, or not Revenue, what Revenue Committee is interested in, what Appropriations Committee is interested in, and how they might be scheduling hearings on those particular subjects. Okay, I will guarantee you the vast majority of them occur starting in September because that's when football starts.
On Friday.
There you go. Absolutely. You can pretty much depend on Fridays being pretty well occupied. Okay, Nebraska State Government, there's an agency listing. I've used that for a number of different things, but that's a great website. You got a particular agency you're interested in, you're looking for a key contact, you're looking for some subject matter issue, that's a good place to start. Again, I remind you, I'm listing executive branch stuff because I think it's important, but I do refer to it as the dark side. I do work in the legislature, and, you know, it's a friendly sort of thing. Just so you know, my counterpart, there is a counterpart on the executive side. The governor's got budget officer, and our offices are kind of mirror images. And he's been my golf partner for about 25 years. So we work out a lot of things, and there are good things about that kind of relationship. But rest assured, we know where the bright line is drawn. We're both loyalists. So it helps, though, in terms of working together on a lot of things. DAS Budget Information Portal. The process of building a budget and receiving agency requests by law is initiated by the executive branch. Okay? Statute defines their responsibility in terms of gathering the initial information. The law also specifies that before that information request is rolled out, as legislative fiscal analyst, I can comment and make additions and changes and suggestions, and have done that over the years when there are certain issues that come along. One of the things that we talk about is that in terms of a budget process and how agencies request a budget, how many of you have any kind of a government background, state, local, state, whatever? Anybody? Military? Okay. You're familiar with the notion of a line item budget. Very detailed, you know, an account for supplies and personnel costs are itemized and so on and so forth. We have that very detailed kind of structure, okay? Very typical of government, okay? We also have a structure that lays over the top of that, and we use a modified zero-based budget concept. We don't use zero-based budget because you get overwhelmed in terms of the decision packages. You don't start from zero. We start from anywhere from about 90 to 95% of current appropriation. We demand that agencies prioritize their request starting from 90% of your current budget. So essentially, we start from the premise you might be looking at a 10 or 5 to 10% budget cut. How do you prioritize the rest of what you're asking for? Okay. That was a process that I used when I was a budget director for the city of Lakin. When I came to the legislative council, I was told, okay, change the process. And I said, okay, here, this is what I do. And that's been the process that we use ever since, and has subsequently been adopted by the executive branch as part of the overall budget request documentation. So we kind of look at the budget request two different ways. And it's nice because you can lay that line item budget next to a prioritization that is more functional. Okay. Do you or do you not keep a particular branch office open? Do you or do you not expand your ability to do stream gauging? Okay. So it's good because you can start laying those two things side by side and you start finding gaps. So it's a process that I heartily endorse. It's part of the overall process that we've used for quite some time. We build a 2-year budget. Okay. So any senators coming in for the first time this next legislative session, you will be confronting building a budget for the following 2 years. Separate appropriations, we don't say, here's a dollar amount you can spend over 2 years. We say, okay, here's how much we've got allocated in the year 1, how much we've allocated in year 2. Okay. It's a way of controlling the budget, controlling expenditure rates, and managing the overall situation. So you'll be building a budget for 2 years. You will also, the legislature will be at that time making adjustments to the current year. And invariably, there are some adjustments. Like I said, the way things are looking right now, I'm kind of guessing Medicaid is probably going to be a little bit too low next year. Because right now, it's not looking real good. There are some other areas that will probably come up short. There's some areas that will be okay. We'll actually be able to back them up. We've done that. That's part of the process too. So that information, that budget portal that I mentioned in terms of DAS information portal, right now you can go look at what the request was last year and the year before, or last session and the session before in 2017. The 2018 session was not a 2-year budget cycle. We were making changes to the existing budget next year, so the format's different. We don't use zero base. We just ask agencies, what are the changes that you see and anticipate might need to be done for the current year and the next year? Because if you stop and think about it, in even numbered years, when you already have a budget, you don't have to make any changes, theoretically. But we had to. We had a deficit in child welfare where child welfare was heavily overspent, and we needed to make an adjustment. There were some other areas where we were able to make some reductions to offset that. So there can be, and usually are, almost always are, changes in a mid-biennium, but the issues that we're dealing with, probably 20% of what you normally deal with in a full 2-year session, okay? So I would go there. You can check out the budget information that has been submitted before. I will guarantee you it is overwhelming. There are certain summary pages that you can find that are more helpful. But University of Nebraska's budget is over 2,000 pages long, so have fun. Don't print it out, by the way. Just don't do it. Okay, at the bottom are some key dates, and this relates to the short session. Okay, and like I said, I used this for groups earlier this year, and I will touch on a long session. But the benchmarks are kind of similar. First week in January, the legislative session will begin. Mid-January, the governor will submit a budget. Constitution requires that the governor will submit a budget. And in odd numbered years where you're dealing with a full 2-year budget cycle, it's January 15th. It is also the same in a even numbered year, but primarily what we're looking at is on or about January 15th, the governor will submit a budget. Okay, that comes to us in bill form, legislative bills, typically anywhere from 3 to 6 bills will be introduced to the legislature along with some supporting documentation. They'll have a budget book that's probably about 2 or 3 times the size of this. It will outline the governor's budget proposal. My responsibility, my staff's responsibility, is to look into that, evaluate it, make some sense of it, but also more importantly, make sense of the agency's budget request and how the two comport. How do they match up? Okay. And this year we'll start right after September 15th when budgets hit the front door. We have access, even though the budget system is built by the executive branch, we have access to it, okay? As the legislative council staff. Okay, so we have access to the very same information that the executive branch works with. Okay, so we'll be working through the requests, doing some evaluations of those requests. My staff will end up doing detailed write-ups that we present to the Appropriations Committee during the legislative session. So in a short session, those reviews occur through January. In a long session, you got 90 legislative days, you're building a 2-year budget, will probably go into well into February, perhaps even early March, sitting down and doing evaluations and briefing the Appropriations Committee. Here's what the Department of Revenue requested. Here's how their priorities look. Here are some new items they're looking at. Here are some other changes you need to be aware of. And as a committee, you go through and you decide. I mean, literally, you show 5 hands. Yes, we include it, or no, we don't. And that's how we walk through it. First 2 to 3 weeks in February, or latter part of March, in the long session, we start public hearings. The Appropriations Committee will come up with what we call a preliminary recommendation, okay? And that's by legislative rule. That's one of the times that you might want to go to our website and see if we filed our report, preliminary report, because we'll distribute it to the Florida legislature according to rules, public document, so we roll it out, okay? So at that point in time, at least what the committee is looking at as a preliminary recommendation is available. Now, chances are it's probably a lowball estimate. Okay? Not always, but it usually is, because the next step is we take that preliminary recommendation and roll it out to state agencies, out to the public, out to interest groups. It's a public document, and we open up hearings. We schedule hearings by agency. And it's an opportunity for the public to come in, for the lobby to come in, for special interest groups to come in, for agencies to come in and say, okay, we like your recommendation, or no, we don't, and here's what we'd like to change. Okay? And we keep a running record of all that in terms of testimony. Late February, early March in a short session, usually late March, April, getting into almost May, we go through a process of reviewing all your decisions. Committee as up to date, all the stuff you've gotten at hearings. Here's new information my staff has collected with interviews with the agencies. You aggregate all that, put it in the front of the Appropriations Committee, and okay, fine, decide. We go through agency by agency by agency by agency and make those decisions. Okay. These are not hearings, but the process is open to the press. Okay. So there can be reporting on those decisions. Now, the more astute members of the press don't show up, because sometimes you make a decision early on in the process and you change your mind later. But oops, you already reported that the university was going to get a $4 million cut. In fact, it's going to be 6, or it's going to be 2 later on. So usually towards the latter stage of the process is when there's more press coverage, because we're getting down to the fine details in the last decisions, okay? All right, by rule, budget is due short session, the 40th legislative day. That's by rule. And a short legislative session is 60 days. So by the 40th legislative day, you get your budget kicked out on the floor. The thought being that you'll probably pass it somewhere between the 45th and 50th day. And you got 10 days for remaining legislation to be acted on that has a financial impact. One of the interesting things about our rules, and it's not completely common feature, but our rules require that mainline budget, the big budget package recommended by the Appropriations Committee, has to pass first before any legislation that has a cost to the general fund passes. So anything that has an A bill, i.e. a new appropriation that goes with a new bill, creates a new program. Anything that causes a revenue loss gets to final reading. Budget bills haven't passed yet. Those bills that create obligations on the general fund, they sit there until the main budget bill passes. And that makes sense. I mean, otherwise there would be a mad rush and pass a whole bunch of stuff, and all of a sudden money's all gone, main budget goes, okay. Now, maybe some people favor that. I don't know, but it's probably not the best choice. You're also handing the governor an excuse to veto any bill that creeps through early before the main budget passes. So that is just a subtle little reminder. There is a rationale for this. Okay? And it wasn't my idea. I mean, these rules have been in place for a long, long time. So other fiscal impact bills in a short session can be read on the 45th day, but I'll tell you right now, speakers for the last several iterations say, no, I'm interpreting the rule differently, and I'm going to hold everything until the main budget bills pass. So we always try and aim to get the budget bills passed by the 50th day. On a long session, we aim for the 80th day, which gives 10 legislative days. Now, so needless to say, there's a lot of jockeying around, a lot of management managing that situation to try and get things into a position and so on. But I mean, those are the rules of how we operate, and it's worked out pretty well. Late in March or in a long session in mid-May, perhaps early May, there will be floor debate. Budget bills, once they are reported to the floor, typically what we do is we take the governor's budget bill and we just strike everything out of it, and we basically rewrite the entire bill. And that's the committee amendment. So that's the first operation of business on the floor is, here's the main budget bill, here's the committee amendment, we explain it, you vote for it, yes or no. Okay. So that's how the process goes. There will be other amendments or other bills, excuse me, than just the main budget bill. We typically have a bill that deals with fund transfers that's separate and distinct from the expenditures, and maybe one dealing with a cash reserve fund, which is our rainy day fund. Okay, so once a bill, that bill is subject to amendment by the floor. Appropriations Committee has first priority on general file, first stage of debate, general file. So when it first comes out, Appropriations Committee amendment has first priority, comes out first. Thereafter, if you're not a member of the Appropriations Committee and you don't like something, you can have an amendment written to add or subtract. Okay, it can be a free-for-all. It hasn't been for a while, but it has been. One time I remember before we had a lot of computerization, I had a handwritten list of 60 amendments pending on the main budget bill, and everybody was serious about them. And it was like running around with your hair on fire trying to deal with it. Okay? We haven't seen anything like that in quite some time, but there are amendments, and they are dealt with just like anything else on any other bill. Okay, so budget bills pass, hopefully within the time frame according to the rules. Goes to the governor. The governor has 5 calendar days, excluding Sunday, to veto it, sign it, or not sign it, which it becomes law without the governor's signature. But more importantly, there's a 5-day time frame in which the governor can be line item veto. An outright veto, I've seen it done once on the budget bill. The budget bill was outright vetoed by Senator Governor Jones. By line item vetoes can be done, comes back to the legislature. There's a process outlined in the Constitution that tells you how do you deal with that. And there's a certain amount of time that the legislature can override vetoes item by item or collectively, all of them. Depends on how I'm asked to write the override motion. But once that's done, it takes 30 votes to override a veto, and you're done. Then other legislation that has cost impacts can be passed, and they can add to your appropriations or reduce revenues. If a bill actually reduces expenditures or adds to revenues, those could pass early. But anything that creates a new financial obligation, a cost or a revenue loss by rule is supposed to be held. So that's the outline. Legislature short session adjourns by the 60th legislative day. Hooray. More than 90th. 90th typically will be towards the end of May. 60th will typically be in April. Flip the page. General fund financial status. This is our financial scorecard for the general fund. It is your fund that receives sales, income tax, corporate income tax, miscellaneous receipts. It is roughly $4.4 to $4.5 billion every single year. Yes, sir.
Before you get off of that first page.
Sure.
I believe our Constitution requires a balanced budget.
You won't find those words in the Constitution.
I'm sorry?
You won't find those words in the Constitution.
I'll try to.
Okay, you won't find those exact words in the Constitution, but practically speaking, you have a requirement for a balanced budget.
Well, that would lead to my question. If the governor waited you out to the last minute and then screwed you over with a veto and the budget wasn't balanced, then what?
Well, if he knocks back, okay. If he vetoes back you actually have funds available more than necessary to support the budget, because the veto is a reduction, okay, reduction to expenditures.
So there's a hedge.
But the governor can also veto back transfers. So conceivably, he could bring things back into quote balance. There's a key important distinction here, however. When I look at a balanced budget in the constitutional sense, there's a very broad general concept. And we don't have those words in our Constitution, but you don't need them, because our Constitution prohibits general obligation debt except for $100,000 in case South Dakota decides to invade us. To fight off insurrection and invasion. It goes back to the 1870s. Okay. So in a sense, since you can't rely on debt to support your budget, you have to balance it based on current revenues, what you collect, not what you borrow. So I think that's an important start point. Our balance point is actually determined by this page right here, okay? And what that is that there is a statutory provision that says when the legislature builds a budget, like you will do next legislative session, you are required by law to build a budget that revenues and funds available for the 2-year period exceeds appropriations and quote express obligations by a minimum of 3% and a maximum of 7%. If you got local government experience, it's essentially like an overlevy.
So that's your hedge fund. So
That's your hedge for cash flow and in terms of balance. So you've got a range of 3 to 7. So when you build a budget and you say we're gonna balance to a 3% minimum ending balance, that's roughly $220 some million, something like that, because it's biennial. It's a 2-year deal. Okay, you can exceed that. So in your instance, the governor says I'm going to veto a whole bunch of expenditures, and we send him a budget that's balanced to 3, and he vetoes it back, and now that calculation is 4. So what? Our balance point is 3 to 7. So, and trust me, when we send the governor a budget, it's a minimum 3% reserve. It won't be 7, but we have the flexibility to do that if we wanted to as a legislature. Okay.
That 3% goes into the cash reserve fund.
Think of it this way.
It's just
This
a
is your checking.
contingency.
This is your checking account. Okay. The bank says you got to have a certain minimum amount in the checking account. Okay. Now, the cash reserve, the rainy day fund that I think you're suggesting is actually a separate and distinct fund. Think of that as my savings account. Do they interact? Yes, they do. The legislature can proactively move money from the checking account to the savings account. Or by operation of law, we do a revenue forecast for this next year. We have a target, how much revenue balances to that budget. If we collect revenue above that, $50 million, by law, there's a certification that says, your revenue exceeded what you needed to balance the budget by $50 million. It goes to the cash reserve fund, so it's an enforced savings account. The fund, the 3% reserve that I talk about here, the checking account, that's statutory, and that what that does is it maintains cash flow throughout the fiscal year. It's kind of like saying, okay, of all the funds available for the 2-year period, you can only obligate 97%. When I worked for the city of Lincoln, we kind of operated under law differently, and it was more like, I can only budget 97% of my property tax levy, or 95%, whatever it was. So it's the same kind of concept, but the way our law reads, it's a little bit different. But fundamentally, you get to the same spot. Where it becomes critical is what we went through here. And it wasn't so much critical the last couple of years where, as we, like I said, we marched through time, we have a change. Well, we had a couple of revenue forecasts completely change on us. Revenue estimates dropped like a stone. All of a sudden, that 3% balance went to like 1.5%, 0.5% as we marched through time. And the legislature determined in 2017 session, 2018 session, which is outlined in here. So go to this document if you want to know what happened the last couple of years. And you might want to write this down. There's a great summary that we wrote on page 6, 7, and 8.
Oh, page one.
6, 7, and 8. It's called the chronology of the financial status. This is our financial status. So starting with the 2017 session, we start there and we said, okay, here's the problem we solved. And voila, we had more problems. So how do we fix them? Well, gee, we fixed them and then we had more problems and then we fixed that. So we walked through the whole process, and that would be a good place for you to start where we've been. And that's when this number changed. We weren't at the 3% reserve anymore. We were at 2% or 1% or whatever. And the decision was to try and get back to that 3% benchmark at each of those change points, okay? What's really important, however, in my estimation, is cash flow. A 3% reserve more or less tells me that on average, we'll probably maintain 25 to 30 days cash on hand for the general fund. Okay, and our low point might be 20 to 25, thereabouts. Okay, as your revenue forecasts drop, you don't change your expenditure rates, then your coverage in terms of days cash on hand drops. So, I mean, we went down to around maybe a bottom of 10 days cash minimum point. And I've seen it a lot worse. And when it gets to that point where you start looking at negative numbers on cash flow, that's when the legislature starts talking about special sessions. At least that's been my advice in the past. So this financial status, if you look at it, the first column is actual. That's fiscal year 2016-17. So those are all actual amounts. And this is general fund. We started with over $500 million of cash on hand. We flowed through net receipts on line 9 of $4.26 billion. We have transfers out, $217 million. Familiar with the property tax credit? By and large, that's what that is. The legislature decided when they created the property tax credit way back when, they decided they weren't going to treat it as an expenditure, but in fact it is. They treat it as a transfer. We transfer money out of the general fund to another spending fund called property tax credit fund. So when I calculate express obligations for purposes of compliance to that 3% reserve, we include that transfer. Because to me, that's a spending obligation just like anything else. But again, the legislature in its infinite wisdom decided they were going to do a transfer out. Needless to say, when it all happened, I argued against that, but I lost. I don't vote. So that's a transfer out. We had appropriations, in this case, in that first column, it's actual expenditures of $4.3 billion. Ending balance on line 28, $247.7 million. If you go to the top of the next column, there you see the same number. That was our fund balance on a cash basis carried forward. Carryover obligations. You have some obligations incurred in the prior year that aren't paid until the next. We have some payroll costs that are like that. We have some other expenses that don't process that quickly. You have bills received but not paid. So we estimate obligations that carry forward. Line 5 is lapses. We cancel some appropriations. You're not going to make the expenditure, so we're going to take it back. So what that does is it adds to your funds available. Okay. So your unobligated beginning balance is $35 million. Well, there's your first signal that you got a problem, because you probably want $200+ million in that beginning balance because of that 3% reserve that you're supposed to maintain at the end of the biennium. So we made some corrections. We had a net receipt estimate of $4,530,000 at signing dot, and this is all at the end of the legislative session. We had transfers out $234 million. We had transfers in. So now we're starting to balance the budget. We have transfers in from other funds of $125 million on line 12 from the cash reserve fund, our savings account, our rainy day fund, which is there to do just exactly what it did, to help cover your financial obligations during a revenue shortfall. That's what it was designed to do. So that's a funds available being transferred in. We had some small reductions, transfers out. In addition, cash reserve fund transfers is line 15. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The 120, the current law was 125, so we already had that in place, and the budget balancing stuff was line 15. Line 9 is LB 946. So we started to balance the budget with fund transfers. We made some adjustments in terms of appropriations, line 22. We had some claims obligations. Now we have an ending balance on line 28 of 165 million bucks, but keep in mind, we got a 2-year status. And 17-18 was pretty much kind of midstream where we were at the beginning of the budget process in 2018 session. So more action took place for 2018-19, which is next year. So that 165 balance carries forward. We have more cash reserve fund transfers. We had net receipts due to some federal tax changes, you may recall. Congress passed some tax changes. We actually potentially had a $335 million tax gain if the state did not make any changes to its existing tax law. General fund transfers out, again, largely property tax credit. Cash reserve fund transfers in. We increased the amount we were transferring in by 4800. We had under current law $48 million. Then we relied on the 100 million earlier in the year. More transfers in of about $16 million. Then subsequently in line 16, we offset the federal changes that were going to cause our revenues to balloon. We basically nullified $326 million of that gain. And the net difference really is corporate income tax. There's a corporate income tax impact that we just could not get rid of. It was going to be a mess to try and change that. And the Revenue Committee decided that we can't do that. So we gained a little bit there. 4.5 billion net receipts. Expenditures, made some changes to the mainline budget. General fund appropriations at 4.4 billion. So now we've gotten back to our ending balance for 2.5%. That was a one-time deal we did last session. We changed the law. We could do that, legislature. If you don't like the rule, you can change the rules. Well, we changed the rules for a 2-year period, and we made it easier to comply with that ending balance. The law will go back to 3% next biennium. So if you're in the legislature next year, that's one of the things you're going to have to deal with. Your first obligation is going to be going back to that 3% reserve, starting from 2.5. So effectively now we're balanced. We're above our minimum reserve by $692,000. That's as if everything on this page comes out exactly the way we've got it laid out. And it won't. Actual revenues will be different. Actual expenditures will be different. And that's where in July, we'll have another meeting to go, oh, gee, here's how much revenue we actually collected for the fiscal year. Here's how the expenditures look. So we'll completely recalibrate this. So we re-benchmark it as a constant iteration. And that'll be rolled out to all members of the legislature to be publicly available on the latter half of July. Okay. The next 2 years, some of my elected colleagues refer to as a figment of my imagination. What we try and do is build a financial scenario and a plan for the legislature saying, okay, those first 3 years, you've got a known fiscal year result, and you got 2 years of a known budget. The next 2 years, my staff and I put together a financial scenario. We project into the future based on what we know and understand to be the operation of the school aid formula. What we project for Medicaid costs. We've got about 25 cost centers that we look at and we say, okay, if you don't change current law, that you just say, okay, we're going to live with those obligations. What do we think those estimated costs look like? And we project them into the future. And I'm not telling you what your budget should be. I'm not telling you what it has to be. All I'm telling you is if you observe current law, here's a pretty good educated guess as to what it might look like, what you might be confronting as a legislator. And I will key you in on one thing that's going to be real important next legislative session, is that part of the strategy to deal with budget shortfall in the last couple of years was a change to the school aid formula. We reduced cost obligations through the TIOSA formula for the state. Those law changes sunset, and the law goes back to a formula that looks like what it was over 2 years ago. So built into this scenario is a cost jump for school aid because it goes back to that prior formula. So the percentage increase in school aid is going to look unusually higher. It'll look higher, okay? And it's going to be because the formula changed. Now, needless to say, there will be massive confusion over that. You know, well, I'm sorry, that's what the legislature did. That's what your predecessors did. And that's part of the reason why we build these scenarios, is to capture those kinds of things. So that you, as a legislator coming into the next cycle, get to remind yourself what you did a couple of years ago. Or if you're new to the legislature, you can look at your colleagues and say, what did you do to me? Or here's a great advantage you handed us, wonderful, okay? So that's why we do it. We try and build a scenario. It's important as you make decisions now for the current budget, for the next biennial budget cycle, what those consequences might be into the future, because we'll take this same thing as we go through the budget process into the next cycle. We're going to add 2 more years out in the future, because the budget you're going to be building is going to be those last 2 columns. That's the budget you're going to be building. So you're going to we'll start substituting actual budget numbers, actual recommendations, actual revenue forecasts in there. And then we're going to add 2 more years. And as you make decisions, we're going to roll those estimates out into the future. And then we also make some assumptions on the revenue side. We display those and say, if this is the revenue pattern that we think is going to happen, are you going to be able to balance it or not? Am I done?
Any last comments, and we'll try to take a question or 2.
Yeah, why would it not be feasible or possible to go on a program zero-based budget where every so many years the department has to go to a zero-based format to develop their budget? I know it would be an ungodly task to do it all at once.
Sure.
But how about phasing it in?
Well, that's not up to me. Okay? But I've done budget stuff for 45 years. Okay. I've done budget stuff for 45 years at the public level. Okay. Let's say, who should we pick on? Department of Corrections. Okay. We're going to go zero-based budget on Department of Corrections. Okay. Where do you start? You got a blank page. Department of Corrections is probably about, I can't remember, it's 120, 160 $million. Okay. If you start with a true zero-based budget, what's your first decision package? And how much is it? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Is it 25 million? It becomes an auction process that, can you practically sustain a corrections department for 25 million bucks? Not a chance. But if you start at 90 or 95, you have some base instead of 0, you have some hope of learning from that and learning the priorities and making some choices. Zero-based budget sounds wonderful. In my experience, it is almost impossible. Now, that does not say that the legislature cannot decide to eliminate an agency. To do what? It does not say that the legislature can't decide to eliminate an agency. We've had those kinds of discussions in the Appropriations Committee for any number of years on certain agencies. I won't name them. But it has been a point of discussion. What about defunding it? First problem you got, the legislation necessary to get rid of an agency won't come to the Appropriations Committee. It goes to the Standing Subject Matter Committee. So if you want to get rid of the Department of Revenue, it goes to the Revenue Committee. So now tell me, what do I do for budget over here when the future of that agency is over here? Well, good luck.
One of the big brouhahas in this last session was was when the university was thumbing its nose at the legislature and saying, you give us what we demand and we're gonna do with it what we want to. What kind of control would the legislature have to say, we're gonna occupy the legislature's golden rule? If we're gonna put up the goal, by God, we're gonna rule.
Legislature constitutionally can appropriate and limit the appropriation of general funds for the university.
They can.
Yes, they can. We can set the appropriation for the general fund portion of the university at whatever level. I would not exactly characterize my experience with the university the last couple of years as thumbing their nose at us. They didn't quite do that. They're not. There's no press, right?
They're recording.
Oh, okay. I won't say it.
I shouldn't have asked that question.
Well,
Eat that, Hal Dog.
you have to understand, the legislature is a constitutional entity. We have constitutional authority. So does the university. And the university has an elected governing board, and there is a constitutional case law, Board of Regents versus Exxon, that basically tells the legislature you have a certain amount of ability in terms of appropriation authority, but we cannot dictate to the university their self-generated funds, i.e. tuition, fees, and so on. The legislature does not set tuition rates for the university. By law, you can't do it.
But they can set the amount.
You can set the amounts of the general fund,
Right.
and supposedly influence the tuition rate, no question. But then that becomes a game of chess.
Thank you.
Right, so we are a couple of minutes over time, and I want to be sensitive. I know some of you need to get back to work. So I just wanted to, a couple of housekeeping things.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being here today. Thank you, Stephanie, Judy, Senator McAllister, for being with us remotely. Hopefully you found today to be a good use of time. We are a resource here for you. Please reach out to us if you have questions. If we can be helpful, if it's research we've already done and is on our website, we can point you in that direction. After the election, we can help with develop proposals, those sorts of things. We're a little hamstrung prior to the election because we can't engage in any way that could influence the outcome of an election. But if we know information, if we've done it, or if it's publicly available, we can point you to that prior to November. So please consider us a resource, and we really appreciate your time. If I could ask you to leave your name tag on the table when you leave, that'd be great. And I think Michael Calvert will probably be here for a couple more minutes if you have some more questions. So thank you for being with us today.